Welcome to Transition to Life, Work, Post-Secondary Education, and Community. This webinar is on Wednesday, May 11th at 6:30. Guest presenter is Domenico Cavaiuolo, Professor, Department of Special Education and Rehab from ESU. Our disclaimer. The ARC of Lehigh Northampton County Advocate Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any others provided by the ARC Advocacy Department does not constitute or imply the endorsement, recommendations, or favoring of the providing party or any employees or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purposes only. I'm going to end my share. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our guest presenter. Dr. Cavaiuolo received his doctorate in special education from Temple University in 1995. And for the last 25 years, he has been a professor of special education and coordinator of Rehabilitation and Human Services program at East Stroudsburg University. Dr. Cavaiuolo was the vice president of support services of VIA of the Lehigh Valley. And prior to that, he was the director of Pioneer Agency, Inc., highly respected and innovation agency who converted its shelter workshop into a total supported employment agency in Syracuse, New York. In 2010, Dr. Cavaiuolo developed a post-secondary education program of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities called Career Independent Living and Learning Studies, CILS, at East Stroudsburg University. Dr. Cavaiuolo has published books and co-authored articles on supported employment, training seminars, sheltered workshops, community integration employment options, natural supports in the workplace, behavioral supports in the workplace, and so many more. His philosophies for creating environments for students and consumer choice, inclusion, empowerment towards support services and education has been evident in his work. Thank you, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Kodi. And thanks to the ARC for putting on these webinars and for inviting me to be here. Can everyone hear me okay so far?
Yeah, we're good, thank you.
All right, very good. All right. Well, let's begin. I mean, we're talking about transition to life, and this is something that I've been working on for many years. I as Kodi was describing my career, it's always been related to some community-based activity, predominantly employment. As I began my career very early on, employment was always one of those initiatives that was very important to me, because I always felt that if we were able to get people out into the community working, then there would be greater acceptance and certainly more inclusion, and that would give people the opportunity to have to be more empowered in our communities. So employment was always one of those things that I worked on for many years. But then when transition got enacted in 1985 through the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it became even more important. It became very relevant to our schools, and our schools then were required to provide transition services. Well, as they were doing that, I think there were a lot of missteps and a lot of issues that were essentially mistaken on the part of our schools. And I don't know that it's an intentional kind of act. I don't believe that anyone in our field does things intentionally to hurt or to damage our system or people in any way. But I think a lot of it has to do with the lack of knowledge with regards to what the expectations are. So transition in schools have been really focused on work. And although I feel work is important, that's not the only thing that transition is all about. So I think when we talk about transition, the first thing we want to kind of consider is, are we preparing students or individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities for life in the community? And whether it be work, post-secondary education, or community living, are we preparing them for all of those things? And that's what I hope to talk about, and what I hope that we will be able to answer tonight. Some of the most important things that kind of lead us into this discussion is what's the what's the purpose of public education for all students? And I think when we ask this question, it's clearly to educate the general public, of our students, the general student population, but it's preparing them for life, good citizenship, and we used to use these as part of our terminology in our schools when we were preparing students. When we would talk about courses leading to good citizenship and those kinds of things. So the purpose of public education is to prepare all individuals for life beyond school, and that includes working, playing, socializing, just being part of their community, and that includes people and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I kind of feel that has been lost over the years, so we have to get back to the fundamental questions of what's the purpose. The purpose of public education is for including students with disabilities. Has been part of the law for many years, but yet again we continue to struggle with and even litigate on a regular basis the idea of inclusion for students with disabilities in regular education. So the purpose of public education is for including students with disabilities, but yet we don't see enough of that. And we're also going to talk a little bit about, where are students today? Where are the students that are leaving our schools in terms of, what is their life like? What are the quality of life for them? Where are they today? And so we're going to try to answer some of these questions throughout this presentation. And as Kodi said, please feel free to stop and ask questions along the way. It will certainly make the presentation flow a little bit better, at least for you, in terms of making sure that it gives you the content that you need. So how effective, so let's talk a little bit about the effectiveness of our system in preparing students with disabilities to meet, the challenges of future expectations for themselves and the service system. And this is a time that I ask people to kind of reflect on. And parents that clearly know because of their children, they can answer this question pretty quickly and pretty easily. But I find that many professionals have a really hard time. For example, I gave a presentation yesterday to the faculty of the retired faculty at East Stroudsburg University, and they wanted to know a little bit more about the SILS program, a program that I operate at the university. And I asked some questions and related to what their knowledge base was of individuals with disabilities. Particularly what do they feel the unemployment rate is for that population? And none of them were really, no one, of the 40, 50 people that were there, no one really had a clue. And that's that's kind of what we typically see. And these were not people who were in special education. So, they obviously, I could say obviously they probably would not have known because they're not special educators. But then again, this is the population that we're trying to reach, the general public, the people who are, on a day-to-day basis that need to understand that. So, when we think about, where are they today? How effective has the system been? There's very little information, very little knowledge of this on the part of our society, on the part of our general population. And this is something that I think we have to really do better at in educating and preparing, letting the general population know where our students are after school. So why do we need transition planning? And this is, again, we're focusing more specifically on transition. We're not talking about inclusion in general and all of those neat things that, I like talking about, but I love talking about transition because this is something that's more, I think, much more clear and certainly in my mind, more outcome-based that provides us with that we have clearer data about. So, students with disabilities need plans and strategies. And this is one of the reasons why we have to do individual education programs, and particularly transition planning is part of that. One of the things I want to say before I continue along this line, and I will refer to it as transition planning, but there really isn't a transition plan by itself. I want people to understand that a transition plan is a section that is contained in the individual education program, in the IEP. And I say that, and I say this and want this to, want people to understand how important this is, because many times schools will try to kind of separate the two and say, well, this is my transition plan for your student, and this is my individual education program plan for your student. And sometimes they have two separate, ideas. And that's where we begin to start falling into, having some difficulties and problems. The transition plan is in the individual education program. And within that, all of the ideas that drive the transition outcomes should be contained throughout the individual program plan, the IEP itself. So that's why I want to emphasize the importance that people don't see this as two different plans or two different documents. It's one document, but one drives the other. So the individual education plan or program drives the transition outcomes that are in that same document. and this is where we see a flow, and we like to talk about things in terms of flowing and fluency and seamless types of transition programming. So we know that this is an important part of to understand and not separate the two. Now, without considering post-school outcomes, students with disabilities will not be successful. So, I mean, if we're working with students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I will refer to it as IDDD in some cases, the reason why this becomes so important is because for most of our student population, most of the students who go to their guidance counselor and develop a 4-year course of study that leads them to either work or college, that's all that is needed for that particular individual. But for students with disabilities, they need something much more concrete, much more specific. And that's where the IEP comes in. It is, many students can actually, figure this out. Well, students that we work with and with intellectual and developmental disabilities are not necessarily able to work things out as easily. So they require much more detailed, specific kinds of activities involved in helping them prepare for that post-school life. So if we don't consider post-school outcomes, students won't be successful because it isn't something that they will be able to figure out on their own. And what all this means is that that there are requirements in the individual education program, the IEP, that are regulations that lead us to, better understand our responsibilities for our students. And although, we take a lot of, we give a lot of latitude to our schools, and we give them a lot of, confidence in being able to guide our students through this process. Oftentimes they're not following the regulations or the rules. So we have to sometimes be the stewards of the rules and regulations. And quite frankly, and that's why I think the ARC is there, this great group of, ladies that are here to kind of be the advocate for the families who are aware of those regulations and rules and can help guide that process along. And again, I don't want to say that school districts are intentionally doing this or violating their rules intentionally, but it seems like, it's almost like a no-brainer. Why is it happening this way when it's clearly stated in the rules, and this being the regulations, that it should be done in a particular manner? So these are things that, we say, or this is, why transition planning and why individual education programs are needed for our student population, and the importance of the two of these concepts being brought together. So what's the what is the gap here? The labor force statistics from October of 2012. Yes, I know it's a few years. It's 10 years old, but these numbers have not changed. Trust me when I tell you that these statistics have not changed. It is estimated that about 28% of working age adults 16 to 64 with disabilities are employed. So compared to 71% of people without disabilities. So we're looking at a pretty wide gap disparity, 70 to 30% difference, 30% working, 70% working. So, okay, let's reverse that, 30% of people without disabilities are not working. And yet we can say 70% of people with disabilities are also unemployed. Huge numbers. And when you look at these numbers, it should really alarm us. And these numbers haven't been improving much. Now, with the labor shortage that we're seeing today because of all the pandemic issues and all these things that we've been seeing over the last couple of years, those numbers may change, and I hope they do. But it's going to take a few years for us to really see the difference and see the changes occurring. But this is a good time for people with and without disabilities for gainful employment, and also a good time for getting some competitive wages, which have been something that have been lacking over the years. Now, the labor force data also indicates that workers with disabilities have had significant higher levels of job loss and hardship during, recent recessions. For people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the disparity in employment participation widens even further when we see those kinds of things occurring. And we're hearing remnants now of the possible recessions that could be occurring. So again, this data is very important because we need to recognize how wide this gap is for our students and young students in schools as they're being prepared. So what have been the outcomes for students with autism spectrum disorders? I'd like to kind of raise this a little bit because ASD, autism spectrum disorders, has been a very large growing population in our schools. So I'd like to focus a little bit on that population as well, and simply because the population is very very broad in terms of we know that there are very bright and intelligent kids who are on the spectrum, but we also know that at the other end of the spectrum we see kids or individuals with very significant behavioral and intellectual challenges, but they're both considered autism spectrum disorder individuals. So again, that's why we see we call this autism spectrum because of the wide range. Well, let's take a look at some of the statistics here. 15% of individuals with ASD are in post-secondary education, going into post-secondary ed, which again is probably it's a very low number considering the number of students that graduate yearly from our schools. Job training with other activities involved, only 13%. So you combine the two, we're talking about 25%. Nearly 75% of this population is not doing anything in terms of significant kinds of activities, whether it be working, going to going to post-secondary ed or otherwise. So we see a huge disparity there. The data from the National Longitudinal Study 2, the National Longitudinal Study you can find on the Federal Registry of the federal government. This is a study that gets updated regularly. And this is the data that has been most recently been submitted. Students with ASD are among the least likely to be actively involved with individuals with, in terms of friendships. 44% never visit with a friend, 83% never receive a telephone call. And I think, these are not alarming numbers to families who have children with disabilities or autism spectrum disorders. 45% of students with ASD have outcome statements of competitive or supported employment, but yet 15% have only, a very small percentage do actually get those kinds of outcomes as they graduate from school. 15% have outcome statements that focus on sheltered work, which I want to talk a little bit about in a little while as well. 2.6% of students with ASD are reported to take a leadership role in their transition plan. That's a very low number. We expect more leadership roles being taken on by students or individuals with disabilities in their transition and in their IEPs, simply because that's where the self-determination comes in. That's where their advocacy comes in. And that's where a lot of the, that's where it all happens for our students in developing their understanding of their role in their life. 67% were not present or during their plan, which again, I mean, when you get these statistics and you read these things, it's hard to know whether it's families that are, keeping their child from participating or attending, or whether the schools are not inviting them. I mean, these are questions that are not very easily answered just based on this statistic itself. But I think once we know that these statistics exist, we should really be more reflective of trying to ensure that students do participate more. And again, those parents that are listening in and are part of this webinar can really we can reflect on this and try to understand the reason and the rationale behind the importance of having their child participate in their IEP.
I'm going to cut in real quick. We did just
Sure.
get a question in the chat box. So the question is, how do we help support our autism friends with significant behavioral concerns when they age out of school? So many do day have programs, but they will not take any kids with behaviors. So thinking of behaviors and possible options outside of school.
Well, there's two things that I can say about this. One, there's always a purpose to every behavior. Okay? Individuals, and I teach applied behavior analysis at the graduate level. I'm part of the BCBA program at the university, where I teach courses that lead students to becoming board certified behavior analysts. And one of the things, most important things that I speak about is to understand the purpose of an individual's behavior. Once we're able to understand that purpose, what function does it serve to that individual? And there is absolutely a purpose and a function to every behavior that every individual student or individual has. So we have to identify that. What I find is that we don't have adequate behavioral interventions, adequate behaviorists in the system to identify all of those kinds of needs for our students. On top of that, and again, I don't know that, I don't know if you all agree or not, but I have to say it because I believe it very, very strongly, is that the competency of many of our staff, many of the people that are in our field, do not meet the level of needs of our students or the individuals that are out there in our communities. I'm not saying that everybody has to be a college graduate in order to work in the field, but I don't know that we're providing, one, adequate wages to attract quality individuals into the field that will be able to support individuals at that level. And are we providing enough training and support to them as well? So again, I think one of the most important questions we have to answer is, do we understand the purpose of or the function of an individual's behavior? And good behavior analysts who have a good background in understanding, or at least in functional behavioral analysis, should be able to come up with that. And I think the most important thing we can do in ABA regarding these things is to do a thorough and adequate functional behavior analysis that will help us to understand that exact question. And once we know what the purpose is, quite frankly, I think we can, the rest is easy, because now we know what we need to do in order to address the needs of that individual student. Now, there are circumstances where students' behaviors are consistent with their disability. That is, that their disability is just their behaviors are a function of their disability. Now, in which case, when that happens, the best thing we can do is find the best fit for that individual, because we can't change those characteristics. We can't go in and manipulate and change those behaviors. The best we can do is find the best fit for that individual so they can participate in our community and in some functional way in society without being so terribly disruptive. The second point that I want to make with regards to that is, if we want, and that really fits into what I just said with regards to the best fit, is when we're looking for employment or services for people with those challenges, we have to do a compatibility analysis. We have to find out what is compatible in terms of work. What's the best fit for that individual? So, customized employment, you've heard this before, I'm sure. Customized employment is one of those things that we utilize with a population where we're very highly challenged in terms of behaviors or other characteristics. But when we are challenged by an individual who poses these extensive needs, and in this case could be behavioral challenges, we just don't dismiss it and isolate the person and say, well, there's nothing we can do. We have to continue to work and try to find the best fit for that individual based on the characteristics that individual poses. So that would be the best answer that I could give to someone like that. It just isn't, it's not an easy fit. It's not an easy answer, but I think we need to get better skilled in being able to identify what the purpose is and be able to find better fit and a better, compatibility match for the world in which many of these students and individuals live in. So that's how I would respond to that question.
Thank you.
Moving along, parents of concern with ID, 80% of parents with ID and ASD want their children to work and to have some kind of work outcome in the future. We know that parents with ID and ASD are also worried in terms of their children's transition process. They're still concerned that that it's not. I get calls on a regular basis because they're not sure whether the school is, providing their child with an appropriate transition. The school is providing them with all of this information and these details, and they're looking at their child's individual education plan, their IEP, and they're not the experts, they're not the educators, they're just following what the educators are telling them, and they call me to ask the question: is this truly an appropriate transition plan for their child? And these are things that are very difficult for parents to understand. So it's many parents do worry about this. Parents of children with autism, report more knowledge of adult services, which is interesting, meaning that they have a greater knowledge base and are more learned about adult services. So they're challenging our schools a little bit more. Parents of children with ID and ASD expect their child to move out of the family home. So again, if these are, these are the kind of results that parents want, then we need to make sure that our transition plans and in our IEP plans operate with that understanding. So what does all this data mean? And what does it tell us about transition and the IEP process for all of our students? If I put this very simply, outcomes, it's all about outcomes. When we see school districts talk about outcomes for the general education population of students, they're talking about how many of them go on to, and those are their significant outcomes. but no one ever talks about where the students in special ed go to. No one talks about those particular outcomes. So the data clearly tells us that our schools have done very poorly and are continue to do very poorly in providing positive outcomes for the students as they leave our schools. So let's take a real quick look at the definition of transition. This is a part of the regulation under transition under IDEA, that this is a results-oriented outcome or results-oriented process. This is a significant difference from the old language, where the old language stated outcome-oriented process. So they simply had to write in what the outcome could be. But now they're saying, they changed that one word, which makes a significant difference in how it's being looked at. So transition is considered to be a design program that is results-oriented process. So the idea that results should be the main focus of our plans and the services that are being provided in our schools. So, and these are important characteristics. Now, to further the definition in terms of the language that's in the regulation, again, this is important because we have to understand, these types of rules and regulations. So when we are talking and working with our schools and meeting with our teachers and meeting with the transition coordinators, we have a solid foundation to say, well, it doesn't sound like what the rules are, indicating to us. So the definition goes on to include a coordinated set of activities that must be based on the individual's needs, taking into account the student's preferences and interests. So what do I do when I go into a meeting? I always ask, well, how did you come up with those outcomes for that particular student? How did you come up with the idea to have that individual go to a coffee shop to, wipe tables? Was that the student's interest? Was that something that the student decided and was interested in doing? So when we start asking these questions, we realize that, that's really not what's happening, and then, quite simply, all we have to do is really just ask, what are you interested in doing? What do you want to do? I mean, we talk a lot about person-centered planning being a focal point in this area. And those of you that are familiar with person-centered planning know that this is something that we can utilize to gather information specifically for this particular area of transition. So, students' interests and preferences are to be considered and need to be part. Now, I've also seen just the opposite. I've seen, IP plans and transition outcome statements as the student will go to the community college and play basketball on the community college basketball team. I'm thinking, well, you can't say that, because even though the student said that's what he wants to do, you're putting yourself in a position, or schools are putting themselves in a position where if that doesn't happen, then the parents can come back and legally, sue for compensatory education because you didn't do what you said you were going to do. Remember, the IEP is a legal document. It is a signed off contract between the families, the schools, the student, that this is an agreement of sorts in terms of what the expectations are for the school to provide an appropriate education for that individual student and what they're agreeing to do. And when we make those kinds of outcome statements in these IEPs, then we're setting ourselves and the student up for failure. So we have to be very careful how we identify post-school outcomes and interests and preferences. And then when we get those kind of questions or those kind of statements, I think we need to dig further in to kind of gather more detailed information about why the student's interested in that, and then maybe take a look at other options that could be considered that are within that area of their interest. We also know that that the IEP, the transition section of the IEP, contains 4 or 3 very important sections, or 4: post-secondary education and training, employment, independent living, and when appropriate, daily living skills and functional vocation evaluation. So the idea here is that these areas are to be considered and to be looked at and to determine what the post-school outcome should be for that particular individual student in each of these areas. And if it is considered to be non-applicable, then a statement needs to be included there to determine why it's not applicable. So again, these are things that are critically important, and not just simply say that, you know, the student is not interested in living independently, or the student will be living at home with their family, so we have nothing to do with that section. It's not that simple. It is not part of the expectations of transition planning and the transition services. So when we, take a look at transition and IEPs, there are three, it's a three kind of prong kind of approach. It's all about planning, preparation, and implementation. The planning comes in when we're doing things like person-centered planning. The preparation comes in terms of how we plan our curriculums to prepare the process, and then we implement those that curriculum to meet the students' needs moving forward. So let's take a look at each of these areas real quick. And I am taking a look at the clock, so we do have plenty of time, but please feel free to ask questions along the way. So where does the planning process start? Well, it always starts with the student and their families. And I always talk about, the students' hopes and dreams. And those of you that are, again, familiar with things like person-centered planning understand that this is that hopes and dreams, vision statements, and all of those things are a very big part of the person-centered planning process. Person-centered planning is something that will give us a lot of information. Not that all of it will necessarily be useful in an IEP, but a good portion of it can be useful. And when we want to find out, things about where does the student want to live, what does the student want to do in terms of their life aspirations, in terms of a vocation, where in what area of the community does the student want to live at and be at? Does he want to live in an apartment with friends, with who does, what kind of friendships does he want? What does he want a social life to look like? These are all things that we can get out of a person-centered plan. And all of that information can be very valuable to us as we begin to talk about those four areas that I just went over with regards to the transition planning or the transition process. So the vision statement is probably one of the most important things that we can ask families to do with their son or daughter. And we encourage families to write a vision statement that includes, what their aspirations are for post-school life. Where do they want their son or daughter to work? What kind of type of vocation do you think would be appropriate? And, again, with the student participating in this discussion, what kind of living arrangement they're interested in experiencing, whatever. I mean, the whole, very holistic, in terms of looking at the individual, in terms of creating a vision statement for the individual that covers everything: social, community, work, all of those things that become very important. And I tell families and parents that they should take this vision statement and make copies of it, make a nice big, in very large font. It doesn't have to be really lengthy. It could be, as long as you want it though, but it can be pretty abbreviated. And, make sure that it's clear and make copies and distribute it to all of the members of the IEP team, so they are clear as to what you're there for, that this is a vision statement for your son or daughter, and this is the expectations for that your son or daughter, and this is what we need to be discussing as part of the IEP in preparation for your son or daughter. Remember, this is the planning stage. So in order for us to plan, we have to take a look ahead. So like we refer to this as backward planning. So those of us like myself, I'm looking at retirement sometime down the road. I met with someone and they asked me, well, what is your lifestyle going to be like when you retire? So I have to come up with, an idea of how much I might need on a monthly basis to live. Then I have to project how many years I have potentially can live. And then I can go now I know what the future should look like. Now I go backwards and say, okay, what do I need to do in terms of preparation financially to be able to make sure that I have enough money to do all of those when I do retire? Same idea here. What do we need to do? What's the plan for our students? So I think, that's one of the most important things that families can do in the transition process for their son or daughter is to create a very thorough vision statement for their children. While we're also preparing, we also have to kind of take a look at what are we preparing students for? Are we preparing students for post-secondary education, or are we preparing them for work in community life? Now, that question, for many parents, if their son or daughter has more significant, intellectual disabilities, it might be a relatively easy question to answer. That is, well, we would prepare our son or daughter for work and community living. But what about a student who is, capable, educationally capable, but still has a lot of, needs, in terms of socially and, community independent living wise and all of those things? What would be the answer to that? Well, if we answer post-secondary education, that's well and good, but then we also have to take a look at what will it take for that individual to be able to function, to live independently, in a dorm, for example, or to socialize with peers. Do they have the capacity, the capability? Have they learned the skill set to be able to function under those circumstances? Because we know that, many of our students who go to college, and I have many students that I know at the university who are on the spectrum that struggle, socially. They're not struggling academically. Academically, they do just fine, but they struggle socially and independent living wise. And, and that's something that they weren't able to learn when they were going through school. And again, I point this out because it is critically important that we address those areas while our students are in school. Again, preparation. What are we preparing our students for? Now, what's important in the preparation for post-secondary education? Families need to understand that there is a big difference between modifications and accommodations. Many students, while they're in school and have IEPs, receive modifications. That is that their curriculum is modified and that is significantly changed. Well, when they're in college, those modifications do not exist. So if we are preparing a student for post-secondary ed, we need to start reducing the modifications that are being utilized in our schools and use more accommodations. So again, understanding the difference of the two makes a significant difference for many people when they're looking at, the at post-secondary ed. Understand that modifications are allowable in our public education schools, in our, our K-12 schools, but they are not allowed at post-secondary education, universities and colleges. Only accommodations are. Another thing that we have to consider is social skills that are appropriate. As I said, particularly those students with ASD. These social skills are critically important when we see kids going into college. I think most of us and all of us who have gone on to college know how important that aspect of university life is for them. The social aspect of it. And we want students to be able to participate and engage in that social atmosphere. So sometimes we have to ask the question, are our students with ASD, if they are going to post-secondary ed, are they prepared socially? And that's the question that we have to really answer. And on top of that, we have to also ask, are they prepared in terms of their ability to function and live and to be able to function independently, whether it be in a dorm or in an apartment setting? Because again, these are important outcomes for students in the preparation for post-secondary education. It isn't just about the academics. It has to be looked at in a much broader scope. So even though a student or an individual has the skills academically, we also have to take a look at them socially and in their ability to function independently. And in short, a student may be academically capable, but are they socially functioning or emotionally ready for college life? And again, that's important. So in that vein, what are we saying? Well, what I'm saying here is that, even though a student may have achieved all of their academic credits to graduate, and they are in 12th grade, and we want to take a look at what are their skill set to be able to function socially and independent living wise. Is that individual student prepared and ready to go on to college, or should we utilize an extra year? And that many school districts call that the super senior, or 12+1, as I refer to it as. That extra year to prepare our students in this area alone, so they can be better, prepared when they do go on to college. We should really take a look at that, that extra year as not a year for academics, but a year to develop all those other skills that are included in the transition plan. Because even though the IEP says that the student has achieved their academic goals, they may not have achieved the transition goals in these areas that will allow them to continue to receive at least an additional year of service, which would include training in those areas. Those, to me, are important things to consider. Preparing for college while still in high school, understanding that what a high school diploma or a GED versus an IEP diploma is, that these are two different. The IEP diploma is compared to a high school or GED diploma. Standardized tests that are, with or without accommodations. Students can take SAT tests with accommodation. It takes quite a bit of work on the part of the district to request that to the testing service office, but it can be done. And again, this is something that should be considered, because accommodations are allowable in college, and if it's going to make a difference in a student's scores or the student's ability to test in an SAT test, then I would say they should really be considering that accommodation. Other things like finding out what colleges, find out from colleges what is needed to receive a 504 plan, contacting the disability services office of the universities and finding out what is it that they need when I come to you and I need an accommodation, what documentation, what information is required. Assess, we should be looking at in terms of preparation, and parents need to be looking at assessing if remedial classes are needed and have been utilized to bring the student up to a certain level. And if those are still, there, if remedial classes are still being recommended, then again, it should really prompt us to consider and talk about whether post-secondary education is a viable option at that particular time. And I would say working with guidance to explore other available options would be important during that preparation for college life as well. So again, these are things that are in the preparation process for our students as they leave our schools and being prepared for school, for college and post-secondary. Now, choosing the right school, what families should look for, like, making sure that they ask the right questions, attending local college fairs about and ask, questions to the Disability Services Office, ask teachers about where past students have gone, who have attended similar disabilities, ask other parents of disabilities where they have explored and what kinds of things that they have they took a look at with regards to post-secondary ed for their children. And if it's a student with ASD, consult, the local advocacy groups. And there are, in our area, the Arch is a very large group of, autism support group that can consult and help in that process and helping families understand what colleges and universities might be more acceptable and are working well with kids on the spectrum, arranging potential visits to schools and investigating the schools has the proper supports. These are all things that parents should be doing in the preparation for their children's post-secondary ed kinds of outcomes. So again, these are things that we would look at for families to consider. So taking a look at the quick difference here between the differences between high school and college. All students have the right to an education, while college is not. Not everyone has the same right. Everyone, open enrollment is there for community colleges, but not necessarily for four-year universities. So again, keeping in mind that there is a big difference between the two. In high school, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in Section 504 and ADA are instrumental in high school, but in college, it's only Section 504, the Rehab Act, and the ADA that are going to be taking precedence in college. In high school, school districts are responsible to identify the disabilities. Well, in college, the student is responsible for providing documentation and verifying their disability. In high school, school district designs the IEP, while students have to design his or her own needs in collaboration with their counselor or advisor when they're at college. These are significant differences between the two. In high school, teachers functions as an advocate. In college, the student has to be their own advocate. In high school, the fundamental alterations to a program of study are made. In college, there aren't any accommodations are allowed, but there aren't any modifications to any of the courses that professors teach. Personal services are provided. In college, personal services are the student's responsibility to arrange if those are needed, like an aide, a personal care attendant of sorts. Transportation to and from school is provided in high school. Well, that's not the case in college. And parents are the primary advocates for students in high school. Well, students are their own advocate. And only when students provide permission to the university to speak to their families and parents, are they then allowed to speak to the parents. So again, significant differences between high school and college that I think is important for parents and people to understand when we're looking at the process of moving from high school to college life. Well, now we're talking about preparation again, self-determination, the process by which we get our wants and needs met. Very, very important. And I have yet to see a high school program provide self-advocacy and preparing students for self-determination in a way that allows them to understand their legal rights and just understanding their legal rights and responsibilities within the laws that are protecting them, like the Americans with Disability Act and the Rehab Act. These are things that schools don't do very much or do anything with. And yet these are some of the most important, preparation process, that is required or that students need in order to be better prepared for post-secondary ed. When we talk about self-advocacy and self-determination, we're talking about things like speaking for yourself, asking for what you need, negotiating for yourself, and even when you're, if you're employed or working, this is also where you have to ask for, again, you negotiate based on your own knowledge, what your needs are, knowing your rights and responsibility, using the resources that are available to you, and being able to explain your disability either by the use of written words, pictures, or gestures. These are all things that are part of self-advocacy and self-determination. The last bullet, just let be clear that there is no requirement that an individual must disclose their disability. It is purely up to the individual to decide whether they want to disclose their disability or not. But again, it's important to note that at some point, being aware of their own disability is certainly paramount in being a good self-determined individual. Responsibilities, when you think about the responsibilities of our schools and what are the responsibilities of our students, well, the main responsibility of our schools is to prepare students with disabilities for life after high school, and that everything that we talked about: work, community living, independent living, functional or self-help skills. These are all things that are the responsibility of our schools. And I believe that many schools don't understand that part of it very clearly. Skills to be able to function in post-secondary life is the catch-all. And that's taking all of those things that I just mentioned and saying that's what schools need to be doing, and that's their responsibility. Self-advocacy and self-determination is also a very important part of the process, and very important for schools to do. Now, what about responsibilities of the families and of the individual? The responsibility of families and the student is to create a vision. You have to really be clear on what it is that you want for yourself or what the families want for their children post life. What is the vision for their child? Determine what direction to take, whether it's educational instruction or whether it's otherwise, whether it's moving in a different direction. So we have to determine whether the educational piece of it is going to be sufficient for post-secondary education, or whether we're wasting our time with any further educational instruction, and maybe we should be focusing on other areas that are more critically important. These are very difficult decisions, and I had a real debate with a family where I felt very strongly that the individual, who was 21 years of age, they had one more year left and they were going to do a compensatory year, and they still wanted the school to continue to work on the students' reading and improve on their reading levels of this individual student. Now, this kid was reading at an 8th grade level. Now, even if they improved it to a 9th or a 10th grade level, which was not going to happen, we know that, or I knew that in the process. So they chose that in lieu of preparation for areas like work and community living. And because they chose that, when the student graduates or leaves school, those areas that he was going to be missing out on were going to then, he was not going to be able to, to get back. So, it's very important to make that determination, and that, when is enough. And if we're not going to get any further along educationally, meaning that educationally we'll only get a few steps further, maybe we need to make that decision early and move on from there. So make sure that the educational services are provided to meet the vision. And I think what parents and families need to do is monitor, because it's important to continue to monitor And, schools are required to do progress monitoring on a regular basis and asking for that information. So they are being held accountable for everything that they're doing. That's the goal. So preparation or preparing the student for employment. Again, the plan in preparation for employment also means knowing what is available. So I want to talk a little bit about what is available for our students when they are leaving schools. So if they're preparing for employment and a career, many of our students will be looking for service providers to provide them with some support in preparation for, in terms of getting out and being gainfully employed. So let's find out a little bit about what we know. Know what exists, in terms of employment. Again, families and those families that are listening in, employment and what the students' experience are for his or her learning are so important. Getting internships, getting experiences, those are important for our students to get and obtain while they're in school. But, the options for our students when they leave schools and we would love to see the seamless movement from school to adult world or to employment doesn't happen very easily. So again, employment should be seen as one of the primary goals. What are the other options that exist that I just want to mention them, but not necessarily do they really exist, because there are waiting lists for all of these adult programs like shelter workshops and adult day programs. There are waiting lists for many of these programs, and we're relying on waivers to pay for all of these services. And we know that waivers are, and the way our programs are being funded, higher rates are being paid for to programs that are providing more community-based services and more community-based experiences than the facility itself. So if that's the case, we should be really reading the writing on the wall, if you will, and realize that there's a focus, a movement away from facility-based to more community-based. Parents need to understand what PUNs are. The idea that it's a needs-based system. That if their children are not put on a PUNs list for a priority of urgent need, well, then they may be left behind and being put on a waiting list and waiting even longer for services. Know these things. These are what parents need to understand and know. What I find is that many parents who have had a lot of experiences working with schools with their children and IEPs and all of that, have a really good foundation for preparation for their knowledge of what to look for when they're in school. But when they leave school and go into the adult service system, all of a sudden we know that there's a big difference in what happens. And many families and many parents are they're caught off guard because it's a different world. And suddenly they have to learn a whole new system for themselves to be able to be better advocates for their children. Housing and community participation, know what's out there, know what's available, and really in this case, what is not available. The idea of social capital is something that I'll just touch on real briefly, and that is that the notion that we build on a social network for our kids, so when they leave school and go into our communities, they have a strong social base to draw from, and have a strong network of support. That comes from a good person-centered plan, but developing a good social network or social capital system for their children is so important, but it's very difficult to achieve. So social capital and building on that is very important. And of course, the other option is post-secondary ed that we've been talking. Also know that programs like ODP and the Bureau of Autism exist now. We don't have one singular system anymore. It's broken up into two bureaus, the Bureau of Intellectual Disabilities and the Bureau of Autism. So families need to identify with one or the other. That is in Pennsylvania. Other states do things a bit differently than we do, but those are the two primary groups or offices and programs that are providing funding for individuals in Pennsylvania. There are some changes that we have seen. The benefits of integrated employment for persons with DD have been really clearly demonstrated. But yet that movement from segregated settings to community work has really been a slow process. We haven't seen the kind of growth. We had a great growth, a huge growth in supported employment initially in terms of getting people jobs, but lately, meaning the last 10 or 15 years, that growth and that movement from segregated settings to employment has really slowed down considerably. So we don't see that gradual increase like we did before. The percent of integrated employment has really flattened since the 1990s, and state DD agencies, directors are recognizing the need for a change. And because of that, there's been a push to move people in for community integrated employment. The total number of people with intellectual disabilities in Pennsylvania on waiting lists is around 13,000. I think that number is very low. I have to go back and take a look at where I got that number. The total number of people waiting with autism in Pennsylvania is around 3,700. But again, I believe that number to be low in terms of what we really know. There is an initiative that has been identified and certainly have been pushed by the federal, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, OSERS, that is about this idea of employment first. This is an initiative. It's not a requirement. It's not only an initiative that they're trying to propose and have states work. And that is that there's no formal definition of employment first, but the intent is really to raise the expectations that employment should be the priority for all students leaving schools. And before students or individuals make choices about going to, a shelter workshop or a day program or any of those kinds of activities, this proposal or this initiative suggests that people first be considered or employment first be considered before any other options. So that means that employment is considered and provided, and only after it has failed does the process move toward a more segregated kind of initiative. So the idea here is that employment is the first thing that becomes a priority, and we should look at employment first before we consider any other option for an individual. This really reflects a change in the system, for more integrated employment, and we're seeing this initiative taking hold, and it's certainly been widespread around the country. This initiative is being proposed all over the country in many states, and some have really taken a more serious note of it. But Pennsylvania is still kind of in the proposed stages of it, and they're looking at how they can make this work in Pennsylvania. So ODP, their policy is that employment first is a framework that is centered on the premise that all individuals, including those with significant disabilities, are capable of full integrated competitive employment and community life, and that should be the priority. It should be the first thing to be considered when a person is coming out of school. So again, we should be, reading the writing on the wall, meaning that we're seeing what the priorities are moving forward and in the future. So we should be doing better in terms of the preparation from school to adult life in terms of transition. So integrated employment means, earning minimum wage, persons working and interacting with people who don't have disabilities, having the opportunity for advancement and receive benefits, preferable, the idea of getting a full-time employment would be a preferred option for most, but we know that, that is not always the case when we're talking about competitive employment. So again, why employment first? The growth of day programs is really not feasible. And I know this is a little bit off target from transition, but again, I think it's important that we recognize and realize that there's many initiatives moving forward that are forcing us to change. And if we don't understand these initiatives and these proposals, our transition programs are not going to be able to comply and provide the adequate support and services to our students and be better prepared for this next phase of our system's growth and change. So, consumers want a better quality of life. Families want better quality of life for their children, and the unfulfilled promise of employment that was promised many years ago for, when shelter workshops were first being created, have never been realized. So this Employment First initiative is really trying to fulfill a lot of those kinds of things. And of course, inclusion is ultimately, the goal for all of this, and make sure that everyone has the opportunity for community inclusion and have a good quality of life. So what are the rights, students' rights, and how do they change when they leave schools? Well, we know they leave from entitlements with the IEP to eligibility when they get into the adult service world, and that is probably the biggest, the biggest challenge that many families face when their children leave school, is this very significant difference in how things are going to be, or how the system reacts to them. And its entitlements are there, and a free and appropriate education is available when they're from 3 to 21 years of age. But when they're 21, there aren't any more entitlements, all eligibility driven. And if you don't meet the eligibility criteria, you may not necessarily be receiving the service. So bottom line, whatever the choice that a student has, it always begins with a vision statement. And when we have a vision statement, the IEP process looks a little bit like this. So you have your post-school outcome statement here. With that post-school outcome statements, it should be reflective in the present levels of performance. And if, again, when you look at the IEP, the very first pages after the signature page and all of those other pages, there is a present level of performance section that should reflect the student's post-school outcomes, and meaning that based on the post-school outcomes, then the student's present levels of performance should be reflected in there. So they're not just academic present levels of performance, but we're looking at independence, independent living skills, work skills. What are the present levels of performance of the individual at that time, based on their post-school outcomes that they have. Then we have a statement of transition needs, and then we have annual goals and objectives that are part of the transition plan. So again, these are, it's a very linear approach, but it always begins with the vision statement or the post-school outcome statement that lead us in that linear approach through the IEP and ultimately the transition components of it. So transition elements of students, are things like describing the future in the area of home living. Again, I'm going to go through this quickly because it's a little somewhat redundant, and we've already kind of covered some of this. Service and activities aligning with the student's vision and reflective of the student's strengths and needs are all, things that are part of the elements of the transition for an individual student. Examples of a statement of a post-school statement for post-secondary education. For example, Sally is expected to be gainfully employed in a job of her choice that will fit her interest in that she will need training in a post-secondary education program to learn the necessary skills. Very, somewhat broad, but still specific. Lead the transition process in the right direction. An example statement for employment Sally is expected to be competitively employed within a job and career path that is based on her interest and preferences. She will be trained and instructed in the areas she needs to be gainfully employed in a job that will match her skills, offer her wages that are commensurate to the job market, and will be adequate for independent living, which while providing her with a career path. Very clear, very, very much, broad enough, but it's specific enough that will lead them to a plan that will provide them with a direction in which they can develop expectations and activities and goals and objectives. And finally, independent living. Sally is expected to live independently with or without assistance commensurate to a level of need in a supportive apartment. In this case, we chose supportive apartment with or without a roommate in an area of community of her choice, so on and so forth. You can see that everything's included in here. So now when we are looking at the plan itself, we have to take a look at, all right, are the activities, when you look at the IEP, there's a section that underneath each of these areas that says activity, who is responsible, what is the goal, what's the activity or the objective, the activity, who's responsible, and what the time frames are for achieving that activity. When you have a statement like this, then you can pick and select and prioritize various sections of this particular goal that you can create objectives for that will lead to that post-school outcome. So again, it's a process. It's not a, it's something that you work with. And one of the things that, I want to be clear on as well is that when we talk about vision statement, we're talking about a vision statement for the student at the age of 21. So if we have a 16-year-old student and we're still looking at, we create a vision statement for that 16-year-old student at the age of 21, then, we don't expect at the age of 16 achieving all of those objectives that will get us to that vision statement, that we said we want to achieve by the age of 21. This is a process. It's a scaffolding process. So what we're saying is that each year you continue to work on objectives that will lead us closer to that ultimate goal or that ultimate vision statement for our students. That's how we create good, effective transition plans, leading students to a positive outcome and a results-oriented outcome when they leave our schools. These are critically important kinds of things to consider. So if we take a look at this, for example, we have the outcome statement, we have our annual goals, and then we have our objectives. And in there, we then are able to, to create, that's or the objectives that are the activities that are leading us closer to that vision or the post outcome of when they're 21. Maybe, if we're looking at an apartment, so living in an apartment, well, maybe a couple of things to look at is that they need to learn how to cook or learn how to clean. And then underneath there are two activities that will lead the individual to learning how to cook or learning how to. So these are two things that can be instructed and be part of the transition plan that will lead them to the outcome or being able to learn those outcomes leading toward a more results-oriented transition from school to adult life. So, these are, again, it's very important that this is all part of the planning and process. The partners that are included in this are, very simple. Family, student, school, businesses is of appropriate. So these are important. So we just talked about, the planning process, the preparation, in terms of preparing students for those, for that plan, and then the literally implementing the objectives and the activities that will lead us to those particular outcomes. So if we were to look at the concept of transition, put simply, step one, family and student and family, think about life after high school, identify long-range goals, collaborate, secondly, collaborate and design a high school experience so that the student gains those necessary skills And then third, connect those to the post-secondary programs and supports and services that exist. So explore those options, in the future, in the areas of employment, continued education or training, living space, and other important kinds of areas. Those are all things that should be explored in the planning process. Families need to decide what options they think would be best for their child. Some families find person-centered planning to be a very helpful tool, and in that students should participate in the IEP meeting and communicate their preference for the future to the team. And this should be lead to a results-oriented outcome statement that they can utilize as part of the IEP process. Once the students' preferences for the future have been identified and written as an outcome statement, a discussion should be, obtained and agreed upon where annual goals and special education services needs are being identified and provided, so the student is being able to identify and work toward those objectives. At the IEP meeting, an action plan should be developed, which consists of steps to be taken by each member of the team, whether it be the family, the teachers, the professionals in there. Those steps should be taken in order, and the action plan should be clearly written. So each member of the team has an action plan to fulfill. So when they meet again, those plans have been, met and fulfilled, leading them to a closer to that ultimate outcome of the transition plan. And finally, after the meeting, maintain communication. Both the schools and families, need to maintain communication and monitor the progress of the IEP. And as the student gains additional experiences, there may be a need to revise the outcome statements or other. In most cases, that it really it just is something that you just add to and continue to add to the IEP on a yearly basis. So it sounds very simple, but it requires a lot of work on everybody's part to make sure that they fulfill each of their responsibilities. Now, IEP outcome questions to consider. Are the specified outcomes based on the students' and families' input? Are out clear, and do they specify? And are they specific enough that it leads them to a result rather than just a statement? If not, what steps are being taken to clarify what the student wants in terms of changing what those expectations are? But again, these are questions that could be kept by families and parents and students to ask while they're looking at their child's IEP. Our goals and objectives linked to the outcomes. Our action plans, steps clearly defined, revised as information and experience gained. Are these things being done? These are questions that would be helpful of parents and families to consider when they're meeting with their school district personnel. The transition planning process has two main functions, and that is activities of preparation and real life experiences. And I find that real life experiences are so critically important. That they are, many schools provide experiences that are not necessarily, that are simulated in nature. And it's so critically important that that real experiences are provided to our students, because they need to learn in context of relevant information. When someone is learning something, they need to learn it within the context of real life situations. So again, it should be real life experiences should be the main focus of our schools. Activities for preparation. Some examples are things like preparing the student for the IEP meeting, student participating in the meeting, or even leading the meeting. So maybe preparing them for that. Researching options for the future, or helping the student research, helping the student evaluate those options, evaluate the progress toward desired outcomes, and students learning to be assertive and disagreeing and speaking up when necessary. These are things that we can prepare our students to do and to be part of when they're in the IEP meetings and transition is being discussed. Like, real life experiences, examples, things like choosing your own courses, developing a resume, applying for service sources, natural supports for help, learning to describe one's own disability. I find that to be very important as well. And learning to self-advocate for accommodations. These are things that students need to learn how to do. And these are real life experience examples of real life experiences that students need to be more cognizant of. Important collaborative partners, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these. OVR, the Office of Voc Rehab, the Office of Developmental Programs, the two bureaus, Social Security Administration, where SSI can be obtained, and Medicaid is part of that, where we know Medicaid waivers are a huge function of that. Private service provider agencies, employment, residential, post-secondary education institutions. These are all things that could be part of our collaborative partnership when we're dealing with transition. Now, I just talk a little bit about post-secondary education options and opportunities that are for individuals with intellectual disabilities. And I'll talk briefly about the Career Independent Living and Learning Studies program. I know there was a question about funding that I want to address in a moment. There are generally three types of post-secondary education programs that exist. A mixed hybrid model, which means that there is a model where students are provided with a curriculum that is specifically designed to meet their needs in terms of learning functionally relevant content, while also being able to audit and participate in regular courses at the college level. So for programs with post-secondary education programs for individuals with intellectual disabilities or disabilities, this is one of those models. And my SILS program, the Career Independent Living and Learning Studies program, is such a model. It's a mixed hybrid model. Now, the other two models exist as well, where it's substantially a separate model where students are simply, provided with a kind of a facility to work out of. So the university becomes that facility, and they're, doing all of their work in a separate type of program on campus within that facility. They're not integrated in a classroom. They're not auditing classes, but simply on campus. So that's another model. Another model that exists is the inclusive individual support model. Millersville has such a model, for example, where students only audit classes, and they audit classes with an academic mentor, and don't have any real specific instruction in areas that they might need, some kind of specific learning in, that would be more life-based kind of instruction. So, there are three different types of post-secondary education models for individuals with disabilities, and families who are interested in post-secondary education should, for their children with disabilities, should really understand and take a look at the three different models that do exist and do some comparison, so they are more likely to select the ones that are specific, for them. Now, if you're interested in families or people who are interested in post-secondary education opportunities, there is a website, so if you do www.thinkcollege.net, that is a all the different post-secondary education programs that exist across the, and Pennsylvania is in there as well. So if you go to the map that they have in their website and you click onto Pennsylvania, you'll see 18 programs. Now, a few years ago, there were only a few. Now we have 18 programs like this in Pennsylvania. And of course, East Stroudsburg program, the Career Independent Living and Learning Studies, is one of those 18 programs. So there are 18 that, again, all three of those models that I described are represented in each of those 18 programs. And ours is that mixed hybrid model. Now, funding, there is when we talk about funding for programs like this, there are generally, 4 different ways in which funding can be obtained. One, it is private pay, where families can pay privately for tuition. And that is one approach. Again, it's sort of like sending your typical son or daughter to college and paying for their tuition. The other is school districts. Some school districts have actually utilized post-secondary education programs at the college level as part of their transition. So they will contract with the post-secondary ed program, and the individual will go to the university as part of their transition from school to adult life, and the school district will pay for that tuition. Let's be clear, though, they only pay tuition. Schools and no one will pay for housing or meal plans or anything like that, only for tuition. The third is through waivers. Waivers are allowable, and there's a service component under the waiver that is considered educational services, and post-secondary education programs can be utilized or can be paid through the waivers under the educational component. Be very careful, though, because usually waivers will pay up to a certain amount, and on that third year, in our program is 3 years. Other programs might be 4 years. In that third year, it may not be enough. The waiver may not have enough to pay for that third year in some cases. So again, the waiver will pay up to a certain amount, and just know that there is a limit to how much the waiver will pay when it comes to tuition for programs like this. The fourth one is FAFSA. And again, it's not really free because it's a loan. FAFSA funding is utilized in some cases, but only for those programs that are considered to be called comprehensive transition programs. Those universities, those post-secondary ed programs that are CTP, comprehensive transition programs, that have gone through the process of gaining that certification through the Federal Department of Education and thinkcollege.net, are considered to be a CTP program, which then allows students who participate in those programs to become FAFSA eligible. So they can then get loans through FAFSA for students to participate in those programs. So those are the 4 different ways in which funding for post-secondary education programs are obtained that are utilized. Just briefly, our program, it's a way to expand post-secondary opportunities for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, getting a community or a university experience and a college life experience, and learning necessary skills to expand their learning in liberal arts, as well as develop their independent living skills, because many of our students live off campus in housing off campus. This is our program is based on providing those kind of experiences. These are some of the things that we do in our program: career exploration, opportunities to audit classes and get a liberal arts education, developing self-awareness and discovery, personal improvement kinds of things, and learning more about yourself, and an opportunity to develop growth of independent living through the framework of living in off-campus residential experiences and those kinds of things. These are the things that I find to be important, and this is how our program operates. So, But those people who are interested in the SILS program, you can give me a call, and I'd certainly be able to speak to you a little bit more about that program. So transition planning, getting back to some best practices for transition planning. Well, early proactive planning is clearly the message throughout this presentation tonight. Active family and student involvement is another aspect to a good practice or a best practice that I feel is critically important. Collaboration with other agencies and people that are going to be able to add to the process of planning. So good collaboration with agencies, organizations, schools, professionals in the community. Community-based work and other experiences that are relevant-based, that are content-based in the community are important. That's best practice. That's what we should be seeing in our schools when we talk about best practices, things that are being done in the community and are content relevant, not simulated activities. Practices like teaching self-determination are critically important to add into our curriculums in our programs, and those are best practice types of programs. Ongoing planning toward desired post-school outcomes. We're constantly looking at those post-school outcomes and planning and preparing. Instruction and functional skills needed for successful adulthood, making sure that we aren't limiting our instruction in academics or in work, but looking at what are the functional needs of our students and how do we make sure that they learn all of those independent and functional skills that will lead them to being successful as an adult. And certainly continuous refinement and revision of the plan is something that should be a part of every program that exists in best practice. So if school districts don't have these kinds of practices in place, then I would caution and I would worry that they're not doing very good with transition with our schools. But these are things for people to consider. Great ideas to improve our planning. Prepare students and families before going into the meeting. That's something that schools could be doing. Conduct person-centered planning. That's something that should be, could be done. Whether the school district sponsors it or not, it could be done. Develop an action plan that incorporates all team members and clearly determines what the responsibilities of each team member is. Along with the family, analyze what the students needs to learn now and in order to have a successful future. Again, that can be obtained through the process of person-centered planning. Create as many experiences as possible. Reflect on their value and importance, and make sure that students get as many possible experiences as possible in a broad range of areas and domains. And these are things that are critically important for students to really gain from. Revise the plan when needed and start early. Starting early. I remember somebody asking me, when should transition begin? And I said, well, if it's a student with severe significant disabilities, they should be starting transition as early as kindergarten, because that's an early start, because we know it takes that long for some students to learn, independent living skills or any kind of skills. So we start very early. So starting early is important in the transition process. So we're down to about a few more minutes, and my final thoughts, throughout this is as active participants in the planning process. This is something that schools need to be doing. In planning process requires creativity and commitment. And it's not an easy task to provide a good, functional, and appropriate transition, but creative and commitment process is something that is very important. Real choices, and again, those real experiences that I've been talking about. Real choices. If we want people to make decisions and make choices in their lives, they have to make those choices based on real experiences, work experiences. So we're asking individuals to make choices in their life and decisions. Then they should be making them based on the kinds of experiences that they're getting, because no one makes a decision based on not having an experience. They only make those decisions based on what they know. So we need to provide them with real experiences to draw from. Student choices are at the heart of a transition plan. It's not just the process. We have to make sure that the choices are at the heart of the transition plan. And finally, effective collaboration among agencies, school districts, and businesses and community members are essential for a good transition to occur. And I think our schools need to provide better collaboration within our communities. And again, if we're looking at effective transition planning, it has to have a positive impact on students, their families, and in their and be very clear that it isn't just the student that we're affecting the family, and we're affecting the community in which that student will ultimately be living in. Okay, I think that's it